The first serious confrontation with addiction did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived like a quiet trade. I remember the smallest decision points. The hand reaching, the body leaning forward, the mind already writing a justification before the choice was even finished. Then afterwards, that dull taste of consequence. Just the simple knowledge. Something is steering me that I am not fully steering. What made it more disturbing was how quickly the pattern repeated. Relief, then demand. Bargain, then cost. It was not just desire, it was looping. A part of the system learning where relief lived and returning there with increasing force. In older stories, this is the beginning of a calling that is not requested. In Siberian and other shamanic traditions, they speak of shamanic illness, the kind of opening or rupture that can tear a person apart. If it comes without training, elders, or a container strong enough to hold the heat. In some traditions, spirit sickness marks the future healer. But that only means anything if he is held properly through that transition. The point is not romance. The point is risk. Because an uncontained opening does not ask whether you have work tomorrow. It does not ask whether your nervous system is regulated. It does not ask whether you are sleeping. Psychology might call this compulsive looping. The brain learns relief and demands it again and again. The body becomes the altar and the hostage at the same time. And the more you bargain with it, the more it asks of you. Shadow material rises with it. Dependency, fear, rejected parts of self that have found a mechanism for temporary relief and regulation. Somewhere inside that, another question was beginning to form. What if something larger than bad habit or poor discipline was also at play? Not in any way that cancelled responsibility, but in a way that made the whole thing more serious. The danger in that question, of course, is self-exemption, because meaning never cancels consequence. Fire always burns. The body still breaks. And the first honest move in the labyrinth is admitting what is pulling you before it pulls you all the way under. After that, something stranger started happening inside me. Not a single voice, more like competing inner currents. One part demanding relief with every ounce of its being. One part insisting I could outthink it. One part begging for peace. And the louder it got, the more my attention fractured. I would be standing in an ordinary moment, light on the wall, the sound of a kettle, the weight of my own shoulders. And inside, it felt like a raging debate that I could not mute. It began to feel less like ordinary thinking and more like a threshold state, where different needs and survival strategies were all trying to seize the wheel at once. In Amazonian traditions, visionary plants and ceremonies are not treated as entertainment. They are treated as ordeals. Exposures that can heal, can teach, but will strip and will overwhelm. Whether you interpret that literally or psychologically, the principle remains the same. Plants and altered states can function like bridges between worlds, but a bridge is not a home. Without a container, visions do not heal you. They expose you. They open the inner weather faster than a human life can integrate it. The older traditions knew this. They place the ordeal inside lineage, inside ritual, inside song, inside witness. And that relationship to forces which is much larger than the individual mind. They do not confuse opening with completion. The opening is merely often the start. Psychology might call this the individual parts of the self competing for executive control. Different needs, different fears, different survival strategies. And when stress rises, the system gets louder. The danger is not that there is depth. The danger is that depth becomes a justification for abandoning basics. This is how people mistake flooding for transformation. What might have become ceremonial in another context becomes utterly destabilizing when there is no structure, when there is no circle capable of holding it respectfully, when there is no one to say, this is real, yes, but this requires grounding. So I started treating basics like medicine. Sleep, even when I did not want it. Breath, even when the chest felt tight and shallow. Food, even when appetite vanished. Movement, even when I wanted to disappear into thought and fantasy. And accountability, not an audience, not a spiritual conversation, but a real relationship where someone can say, stop, and I stop. Because the thread is not philosophy. The thread is structure. And if you cannot be held, you are not in initiation. You are in risk. There was a moment when control was lost. Not an epic breakdown, but as the sudden recognition that the mind could run on its own momentum. I remember feeling my heart in my throat. The room felt too sharp. The smallest sound had a sharp edge to it. My thoughts were not lining up like a neat argument anymore. They were arriving like weather, and I could not convince myself back into calm with pure thinking or ideas. In the Vedic tradition, soma becomes a useful symbol here, not as a recommendation, not as a prescription, but as a mythic mirror for what happens when perception shifts and the world turns luminous, persuasive, and unstable. One sip and the gods feel close. One sip and the boundary between symbol and reality thins. More broadly, this belongs to the same family of visionary openings that traditions have long approached with caution. Plants, rituals, static states that can heal or break, depending on whether the person has any structure strong enough to receive them. Psychology might call this altered state amplification. Arousal arises, pattern detection spikes, and the brain starts connecting dots faster than it can verify them. The mind begins to move beyond the linear, but beyond the linear is not automatically wiser. That is where men get seduced, by the feeling that intensity equals truth, and the deeper burden sits right behind that seduction. Once perception has shifted, ordinary life can start to feel thin, unchanged, almost insulting in its refusal to confirm the significance of what you are actually living through. This is how the return becomes difficult and sometimes catastrophic. That is how vision becomes isolation. But intensity is not a license. It is a warning sign. So the grounding had to be physical. No matter what the mind is claiming, the world remains the world. The only way out is the thread. Psychological instability began appearing the way weather appears. Uninvited, changing fast, abrupt, hard to predict. Some days the mind felt clear enough to function. Other days it felt as if the door was subtly moving beneath me. I notice it first in the body. Dullness behind the eyes. Agitation that made rest feel impossible. I would catch myself searching for a final explanation, some kind of master key, a sentence that would seal the cracks. In Tantra, they speak of awakening force, and again, if you strip away the romance, you are left with a sobering principle. When energy rises without preparation, it does not automatically become wisdom. It can become agitation. It can become inflation. It can become danger. Kali belongs nearby too, as the destroyer of illusion, the force that cuts through what is false, whether or not the personality is ready for that. Anxiety can feel like that when it is dismantling old structures, but feeling dismantled is not the same as being trustworthy. Psychology might call it dysregulation. The body cannot downshift, so the mind starts narrating the intensity as meaning, as specialness. This is also where Jung's pura aeternus pattern becomes visible again. The part of a man that wants altitude without weight. The part of a man that wants insight without responsibility and specialness without correction. When that pattern meets dysregulation, the risk increases. A person begins to interpret instability as proof of depth. He feels misunderstood and starts imagining himself as dangerous for sacred reasons, rather than admitting he may simply be escalating. Communities then respond in predictable ways. Projection gathers, concern hardens, and the person who most needs holding begins to experience all restraint as an attack. That is the difference between a man walking the edge with a rope and a man sprinting near a cliff because he likes the view, unaware of his imminent death. The labyrinth does not care about your story. It cares whether you have structure. If structure breaks, consequence arrives through the body, through relationships, through the law. So the work was to stop negotiating with reality and start rebuilding the thread as if it were my only viable life support. Eventually, the realization landed with a kind of cold clarity. Philosophy was no longer something I read. It was something I was living. I could feel that in the body before I could phrase it properly. The sense that the process was moving whether I liked it or not. The ideas were not abstract anymore. They were pressure. They were fear. They were the strange sensation of being inside, something that did not pause when I wanted it to. That was where the myth stopped being comparison and became orientation. The stories I had read through, Jung, Campbell, comparative mysticism, and religion, all of it was no longer interesting because it was merely clever. It became useful because they described what it feels like when a human being is taken below the level of preferred identity and cannot simply think his way back out from that place. That is where Jonah inside the whale becomes the clean mirror. It is no longer a neat and clean metaphor, a clever play on words. It becomes a containment. It becomes a lifeline. A man swallowed by something larger than his plans, forced into darkness where no performance works, where he does not recognize the environment, where the only honest move is to stay alive and tell the truth. Psychology might call this the collapse of narrative control. The mind cannot keep its preferred identity intact, so it either surrenders into humility or fights and fractures into a million pieces. Inside the whale, you do not get to bargain. You do not get to play clever romantic games. You regulate. You breathe. You count the cost. You accept that you are not exempt. And somewhere within that acceptance, another truth begins to appear. Sometimes the crisis only starts to resolve when you stop insisting on the old identity and accept that you are being changed by it, transformed, alchemized. That is also where the wounded healer pattern first became imaginable to me. Not as a role to claim, but as the possibility that what was breaking might also be teaching me, if I am able to survive it honestly enough. The grounding return then is not a triumphant speech. It is a contract with the boring, ordinary basics. Sleep protected like a boundary. The body treated as the altar, not as the enemy. Substances approached with seriousness, not mythology and fantasy. Community consciously chosen over isolation. Responsibility kept, even in small doses, because small doses are how you rebuild a life. And the line repeated itself until it became law in the bones. Meaning never cancels consequence. If the door has opened, your job is not to worship the opening. Your job is to hold the thread.